we are going to bring in John Fullerton to speak about regenerative business. And it would be very interesting to hear about the experience of John Fullerton. And hopefully then we'll have some dialogue, because one of the big surprises of this afternoon is that Gunther Pohly, one of the founders of circular economy, has arrived. It's an honor also to have some commentary about also regenerative business by Gunther and to have a bit of dialogue. So let's start with John.
Well, thanks very much. I was able to listen in on the last half of the last discussion, and it's very encouraging to hear, in a sense, the rubber starting to meet the road. I think Europe is ahead of the US on all that, I must say. So that's encouraging to see. What I would like to share is, in a sense, a glimpse at where I think we're heading, or where we need to head. And just to give you all a little bit of context as to, in a sense, who's saying this. My background is in big finance. I spent nearly 20 years at what I always like to call the old JP Morgan before leaving in 2001. I came up through primarily the capital markets derivatives business, but then the last few years focused on venture capital and private equity. And since then, I've become what we now call an impact investor. I tend to focus on food and agriculture primarily, but many other things. But my real passion is this thorny question of the future of economics, the future of capitalism, the economic system design that we will need to migrate to if we are to not break the planet and destroy all that we hold dear, and do it in a way that is equitable and just to the people that are now part of the human race. And I'd have to say that my work tends to be very challenging to people. It's very much out of the box thinking. It's very much unconventional, non-incremental. And so I ask everyone to bear with me as I walk you through this learning journey I've been on, and withhold judgment on whether this fits into your thinking and whether this is right or wrong. We're all trying to figure this out, but this is a perspective that does come as a result of a now more than 10-year search for answers to very, very difficult questions if we are to be honest about the challenges we face. The first thing I'd like to say is that I think we're trapped in a perception created by the theories, particularly of economics, but more broadly than that. And so we actually can't see outside of the limitations of our current world paradigm. And I'd like to suggest that this has happened before. We actually used to operate in a Earth-centered worldview, the idea that the planet was the center of the universe and the sun and the other stars rotated around the Earth. And it was literally thousands of years that the astronomers were proposing theories or fixes to the glitches that they saw as to why planets would sort of rotate around and then reverse course and then keep going. And it wasn't until Copernicus came along and suggested that no, the Earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is the center of our world, and the Earth is rotating around the sun. And the field of economics, and this is no criticism of economists, because we've essentially inherited the history of the economics profession, but economics was built, the neoclassical economics, which is the current foundational economic thinking that's taught in our universities and is the foundation of political economy thinking, whether it's the liberal version or the conservative version, is literally built on a foundation of Newtonian physics. And there's all kinds of problems with that. And one example of where that has led us is that literally 3 years ago now, the Nobel Prize in Economics, which is not actually a legitimate Nobel Prize, but the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to William Nordhaus for his model that suggested that the optimal global warming we shoot for is 3.5 degrees Celsius. And this was in the face of our understanding from the IPCC and the world climate science, industry, if you will, that 3.5 degrees is an absolute disaster. But the economics profession somehow was so obsessed with the idea that economic growth is the path to our prosperity, they couldn't fathom the possibility that you had to question exponential economic growth, despite the fact that we live on a finite planet. So the idea of regenerative economics begins with a search for an alternative worldview about what economics really is that can deal with the precipice that we find ourselves on today. When I started giving these talks, I used to have to explain why we're on a precipice, but obviously that's no longer necessary. So the first kind of big idea I'd like to share, or at least propose to us all here, is that the shift we're now facing, the changes we're facing, the challenges we're facing, are nothing short of a shift in era similar to the shift from medieval period to the modern era. And we have a whole new worldview. The modern era introduced the idea that the universe and the world is a machine, and we could break the machine down into its parts and understand the parts. This was the result of the scientific method and the scientific revolution, which obviously created all kinds of great advances. But we've now reached the limits of this reductionist clockwork universe worldview, and we're emerging into what many are now calling an integral era, where the metaphor or the model is a web or an ecosystem as opposed to a machine. And this is new. No one living today has ever experienced this. And so no surprise that it's very unsettling. But a little bit about how the universe actually is organized. This comes from the latest scientific understanding of complexity science. Unlike classical physics, which again, economics has its roots built on, and classical physics is largely around single cause and effect descriptions in the physical world, most of the world is actually comprised of wholes. And wholes are intertwined and interconnected. Such, for example, the whole of a family is comprised of the wholes of the individual people in that family, or the whole of a business is comprised of the different business units in the business. And these are all interconnected in a very complicated way, and in fact, in a complex way. But in economics, we use statistics, which has the assumption of disconnected causes to explain the uncertainty that economists know exists. And so that's essentially combining an inaccurate approach to mathematical uncertainty with an outdated understanding of physical laws to come up with our modern economics. And it's simply not consistent with our genuine understanding of how the world actually works, which is this interconnected, complex whole, which, despite the complexity, produces exquisite order. And we see that throughout the natural world. And I would suggest that the human economy is part of the natural world. It's made of human beings. It's embedded in what we call nature, what we call the biosphere. And for it to be sustainable, like other living systems in the natural world, the premise is that it will need to follow the same patterns and principles of other living systems. Now, I first wrote about this in 2015. It's building on the ideas of many, but it really introduced, I think, into the conversation this idea of a regenerative economy and what that would need to look like. And I believe this shift from reductionist thinking to holistic thinking is not limited to economics and finance by any means. It's actually cropping up everywhere, from agriculture to education. We think of transdisciplinary education. It's very vibrant now in healthcare, the idea of integrated medicine. And then, yes, it will impact the world of business and banking, even though the current response to the environmental crises and the social issues are not yet regenerative. They're more incremental change from within the existing paradigm. So a quick definition: regenerative economics is the application of nature's laws and patterns of systemic health, self-organization, self-renewal, and regenerative vitality to our socioeconomic systems. And this really, I believe, is the next evolution of our economics thinking. Similar to the astronomers in the old days, much of the advances in our economics have been patches to the fundamental flaw of neoclassical economics. And even ecological economics, which I have a huge amount of respect for and am a student of, concludes that since scale matters, we need to put limits to the growth of the metabolism of the economy. That is certainly true. But without a reference to living systems principles, the conclusion of limiting growth becomes quite pessimistic. And we all understand that if we shrink our economies, all kinds of bad things happen. And the promise of regenerative economics is that there's all kinds of currently hidden but very real potential that's waiting to be unlocked if we can align the system with the same patterns and principles that describe other living systems. And I've seen that in my own investment practice, so I know it's real on a micro scale. And the question and the challenge for all of us is how to manifest that across something as large and complex as the global economy. Drawing on one of my teachers, Bill Reed's beautiful diagram, just to place regeneration in the context of the sustainability conversation, the important thing to take away from this visual is that regenerative behavior over on the right is the result of the regenerative process. And if we want to have a sustainable economy, we need to run the economy in accordance with living systems design, following the regenerative process, and then sustainability will be the outcome. Much of the sustainability conversation in business and in finance is naturally, and this is not a criticism, it's the logical thing to do, is trying to move from our degenerative model over on the left incrementally towards this sustainability objective. But as the analogy I would say is it's like climbing Mount Everest. Every step we take towards sustainability, the next step only gets harder. And eventually we'll find that we can't reach it. What we need to do is flip into a regenerative mindset where we unlock this currently hidden potential that is the opportunity to create wealth, creates prosperity, create well-being in new ways that we currently don't see because we're trapped in this degenerative design. Now, in the paper, I talk about 8 principles. They're just my best effort to reduce, and again, in a reductionist way, the complexity of living systems to a finite number that we can use to communicate. I won't go through them each here, but I'll just make a couple of points. The first one being the idea of right relationships, symbiotic relationship, reciprocal relationships. All living systems have healthy relationships of reciprocity. And if you think about the entire financial system, if it looks at the world through its sort of finance lens, it sees the economy as a vehicle to optimize the returns on capital through. And the economy uses the planet, natural resources, human resources, combines them together into business enterprises in such a way as to optimize the return to capital. Now, I'm a finance person. This is what I used to do for a living. Not because I'm a bad person, that's because the way we've designed the system. But of course, if we understand that living systems need to be in right relationship, the whole here, the higher level whole, is the planet, the biosphere. The economy sits within, is embedded in the planet. And finance needs to be understood as a subsystem of the real economy. And like all subsystems of all other healthy systems in the universe, it needs to work in such a way as to support the health of the real economy. Now, another one of the principles is balance. We know from yoga that balance is a secret to our vitality. It turns out through the rigorous study of real living systems, they also balance what we call efficiency and resiliency. Now, isn't that interesting that living systems seek to balance efficiency with resiliency, and yet our economics profession and our economics worldview suggests that we should always pursue efficiency. And the global supply chain crisis we're seeing right now is the consequence of the endless pursuit of efficiency at the cost of resiliency. And you see that it's not a sustainable system. Same thing happened several decades ago when we had the financial crisis. We on Wall Street were in the pursuit of efficiency, and yet the financial system became very brittle and collapsed. Now, I talk a lot about the financial system and applying these 8 principles in a second book I wrote back in 2019. Both of them are available on our website. And I again tried to lay the current sustainable finance conversation and products and activities on the same spectrum, where on the left, it's conventional degenerative finance activity and moving toward ESG, engaged ESG, much better than ESG. Green bonds that you just heard about are where we can kind of flip from the degenerative state to a regenerative state, particularly green bonds that are financing projects that otherwise wouldn't get financed on the balance sheets of companies. And then there's a whole new world off to the right, which doesn't really exist yet. But I think the next 10 years, we'll see all kinds of innovations and different ways to think about the role of capital in a truly sustainable economic system. Now, how do we apply this to business? I'm sure Gunter is going to share, he's got a personal Rolodex of projects and experiences that he'll be able to share with you in person. So let me focus a little bit on perhaps how to apply this in the large business sector, multinationals. How would this apply to multinationals? Well, the first thing I would say is we need to begin with the 8 principles and use them as our compass. Those should inform our culture, the purpose of an organization, its behaviors, how it preserves its own health. But there's also governance and capital structure, business models before you get to products and services. And unfortunately, we naturally start with the products and services, but we miss all these other pieces. And to be a truly regenerative company, all of these are going to need to be aligned with the 8 principles of healthy living systems. And again, to emphasize, they don't need to be my definition of living systems principles. It's literally impossible to describe the complexity of living systems with 8 principles. But these have proven to be an accurate place to start. The maps that we need to draw for each individual organization are going to be unique to that organization. But the compass, I would suggest, the principles are what remain constant. Now, let's see how this shows up in the real world. Well, there's a huge focus now, obviously, on cows and meat being a problem. But I would question, is it really the cows that are a problem, or is it the business model of the industrial meat industry? Just as a little interesting fact, in the United States, there used to be more buffalo roaming across the plains than we currently have cows in this country. And we didn't have climate change back when the buffalo were roaming. So it's not as simple as, well, cows fart and therefore we need to eat less cows. It turns out it's actually the business model. The industrial feedlot system is what is the disaster from an ecological perspective as well as a health perspective. And I'm all for people choosing to be vegans, but we should do that with an informed understanding of the important relationship. Again, one of the first principles, the relationship between large herbivores and their internal digestion system and how it plays on the world's grasslands. Now, why is this important? The grasslands are the second largest carbon sink after the oceans, more significant than the forests. The photograph you're looking at on the right has cattle managed holistically in a symbiotic relationship, similar to the way the buffalo roam. The photograph to the left of the fence line is conventional approach to managing cattle. It doesn't take a PhD in climate science to understand that the healthy grass on the right, which sequesters carbon through its root systems, is going to be a much healthier impact on the planet than what we have on the left. And the data actually shows this. You can see white oak pastures there on the left actually is a net carbon sequesterer, even though it's producing beef, hogs, and chickens. And the conventional beef industry, of course, all the way on the left is the worst of all. But even the plant-based meat alternatives are carbon emitters, whereas holistically planned grazed cattle, actually including their gas, become net carbon sinks if managed holistically. So the issue is not cows, the issue is management. And the only way we see that is if we get clear on what the principles are. In that case, the principle of right relationship between herbivores and the world's grasslands in particular. But all of the principles need to apply. Now, last year, the CEO of Walmart announced that Walmart had an intention to become a regenerative company. And their definition was one that works to restore, renew, and replenish in addition to preserving our planet. Now, there are many, many challenges for a company like Walmart to truly become regenerative, because regenerative doesn't just apply to the natural world or nature. It applies to the communities in which it lives and the employees of the company as well. And I'll just leave it at that for the purpose of time today. Now, Google's an interesting example. I would suggest that the technology or the product of search is potentially one of the most regenerative innovations, certainly in our lifetime. The principle that it in particular highlights is the principle called robust circulation. A healthy living system has a metabolism. And what we now call the circular economy is actually metabolizing economy. And it applies not just to materials and energy, which is the way we think about it in circular economy world, but it applies to information and empathy as well. And what better way to enhance and accelerate exponentially the circulation of information than the innovation of search? The problem with Google is that Silicon Valley enforced on it an extractive, reductionist, conventional business model, which is to essentially extract data and optimize advertising sales. And optimizing advertising sales to grow consumption literally means to destroy, is a business model that takes a brilliant innovation, regenerative innovation, and turns it into a degenerative business model. Now, what about banking and finance? I recently gave a talk in Egypt, and we had an interesting discussion about Islamic banking. One of the features, as many of you may know, about Islamic banking is that speculation is prohibited. Now, let's think about speculation. By definition, speculating is a win-lose proposition. There's no symbiotic win-win relationship between speculators. And so the relationship between investors and the enterprises that they invest in has been destroyed. And we see very unhealthy consequences of our super speculative financial market. Well, now, rather than arguing that speculation is a bad thing or an evil thing, we just look to the principles and say, well, it's not aligned with the principles of living systems. Well, it turns out in Islamic banking, when you eliminate speculation from the financial sector, the capital tends to flow into small, medium, and large real economy enterprises. And all kinds of good things happen as a result. So I would suggest that using the principles as our guide should dictate how we rethink about how to regulate the financial sector in such a way that we're not just chasing yesterday's problem, but we're actually designing into the system a structure that will support the regenerative vitality of the economy, not just the financial system. I've gone through this entire talk and I haven't mentioned a word about ESG or metrics or impact metrics or anything. And that's by design. If we don't get clear on the regenerative process and manage to design our economy and our financial system such that we align ourselves with the regenerative process, we're going to be measuring the wrong things. And finally, just a quick comment on cryptocurrency and all the craziness that's happening now. I actually see this as a very hopeful possibility. I am not a fan of Bitcoin. I use an analogy. Bitcoin is to the cryptosphere what pornography was to the internet when the internet first came around. But the next generations of cryptocurrency show tremendous potential to wire into our financial system the alignment with the 8 principles or living systems principles. And so I believe we're currently moving from traditional finance, but we're essentially morphing it onto this decentralized technology platform on the blockchain and going to recreate many of the same problems on steroids on this decentralized platform. But already in the works, and I'm already involved in really interesting conversations around this, there is the possibility of coding into currency the behaviors, the incentives that we want that will actually align our money systems with what's required of a regenerative economy. So in summary, I would say economics is built on a flawed foundation. We need to shift to a living systems worldview. Economics is applied ecology. It's not its own science. Finance is a subsystem of the real economy and must be in service to the health of the whole being the real economy. We need to get clear on your universal patterns and principles of living systems. This will provide a reliable compass, and we need a reliable compass because we are lost. It's the regenerative process that unleashes unseen potential. And finally, regenerative potential is the source of our shared prosperity in our now full world. And a final quote from one of my favorite teachers, Bucky Fuller, who wrote in his final book that was published the year he died. He says, "Nature is a totally efficient, self-regenerating system. If we discover the laws that govern this system and live synergistically within them, sustainability will follow and humankind will be a success." And what was fascinating for me is I read that book after I published my own paper. So it was very comforting to know that I'm on the track of people who've come before me and are frankly much wiser than I am. And that's hopefully some good fodder for discussion.
Thanks a lot. This is a whole series of managing within limits, bringing businesses on board, trying to be really, at least for no negative impact, then going deeper, going for regeneration, for recovering the planet and society, the two. Many, many thanks to John Fullerton.